Welcome everyone, welcome to Friday. We are starting the weekend and it's also almost time to be back finally on camera. However, not quite yet. For today we are talking about something that interests me. Perhaps it's gonna interest some of you as well. We are looking, given that it's the 27th of January, and I'm sorry to depress you a little bit, but we are now 2 months into the expansion. As we hit this 2 months milestone, we are going to go back in time and we are going to compare what we thought, what we expected, and what players were thinking was going to be the meta, were going to be the popular specs to play for Season 1 of Dragonflight. We're going to compare the reality, we're going to compare the truth of today with the fake news of 2 months ago to see how much things have changed, or perhaps how much players, how much content creators, including myself, have gotten wrong from 2 months ago. Now, of course, that we have to make some disclaimers. Sometimes some of these picks are going to be completely wrong because they were misjudged, and other times they simply were not wrong. It was just Blizzard who decided to either nerf or buff significantly a certain spec to the point that it became much more powerful or much weaker than it was a couple of months ago, than it was in the beta, etc, etc. So let us start from the least changed predictions. Guys, do you remember those interesting things we were doing right at the start of the expansion, where we were checking the amount of players leveling their characters and gearing up their characters past a certain item level? It's the thing we were doing to try to guess, to try to pinpoint which of the specs were going to be the popular ones. Even back then, we got a pretty decent idea of what the healer situation was going to be. Because in what we can call the pre-season, in the pre-season meta, the thoughts were that Preservation Evoker and Restoration Druid were going to be the most powerful. The thought also was going to be that Preservation was going to be stronger in the raid and second strongest in Mythic Plus, below Resto Druid, while Resto Druid was going to be stronger in Mythic Plus but not stronger than Preservation Evoker in the raid. Then the second best were going to be Discipline Priest and Holy Paladin. Discipline perhaps a little bit more in the raid, and then Holy Paladin a little bit more in Mythic Plus, and then below them you had the clear gap of the remaining 3 specs, Mistweaver and Holy Priest, which were still functioning specs, just a little bit weaker overall, and then the much weaker, much lower down, much more depressed Restoration Shaman. So that was the prediction even before the start of the season, even before the expansion. What happened now? Well, now the difference is that there is just an even larger gap than we previously thought from the top 2 to the rest of the healers. That's basically what has changed. Even with several rounds of balance tuning, several rounds of changes, it's not that many / most of the healers have received a lot of them. In particular, Druid and Evoker have not really been touched. In fact, hilariously, Druid has been buffed. Restoration Druid got a 5% healing buff, for example, and they were even buffed in raid talents as well. Some of these specs have been significantly buffed for 10.0.5. This is going to be interesting to see if, going deeper into this patch, a few of these specs, in particular Discipline, Mistweaver, and Restoration Shaman, are the 3 specs which were given a pretty significant round of buffs overall. So it's going to be interesting to see how things will change, but for now, the difference between the release of the expansion and where we are now is not really seen in terms of power and meta situation of the healers. So given that the healers were kind of stationary, what about the next role, which is the tanks? Tanks, before the release of the expansion and before the release of the season, had a question. You had 3 seemingly very powerful tanks at the top that players were thinking about. Vengeance Demon Hunter, Blood Death Knight, as well as Protection Warrior, with quite close behind Guardian Druid. this was also seen, this was also represented in the first couple of weeks of the launch of the expansion, before the season was out, by the number of players gearing up these specs. This was because, of course, Guardian Druid was given a massive damage buff in particular right before the release of the season, which hyped up the spec by a lot. And then you had the other specs that had gotten to be quite powerful from the beta feedback. Protection Warrior looked extremely strong, Blood Death Knight was still very, very solid, and Vengeance Demon Hunter was doing a ton of damage and healing for a ton, so it was quite the solid spec in the beta. Now, while still in the beta and then in the first couple of weeks of the preseason, we had a few changes to tanks, like in particular the 10% damage taken nerf to all of the tanks, which ended up hurting pretty much all of the other tanks more than it did to Protection Warrior. So where are we now after a couple of months of this season? Well, Protection Warrior and Blood Death Knight more or less have kept their position. The only one that basically lost a lot compared to what was thought of them is Vengeance. Vengeance is definitely nowhere near the power level players thought before the launch of the expansion. I put overall, purely based on performance so far, Protection Paladin even above both Vengeance and Guardian, with Brewmaster Monk at the far bottom. Brewmaster Monk was quite the abandoned spec even in the beta and in the pre-season, the least played tank by quite a bit as well. So this rankings for the record do not take into account, as we mentioned for healers as well, the recent round of buffs for 10.0.5. In this case, the most buffed spec for the tanks, pretty much also the only buffed spec for tanks, is Brewmaster. So Brewmaster might rise eventually thanks to these changes from the patch, but not at the moment. So at the moment, this is the snapshot we have about a couple of months into the expansion. So most of the tanks have kept their previously thought of expectations. The only one betraying the expectations in the negative has been Vengeance Demon Hunter. Then we move on to the DPS, starting from the melee. So this was the pre-season as well as beta situation when it came to the melee DPS and how they were both performing but also how popular they were. For example, in this case, it was less about assassination and subtlety being terrible and more about pretty much all of the rogues playing Outlaw, because Outlaw was doing super good back then. There was also surprisingly quite a good feeling around Feral Druid, a good feeling around Red Paladin, and even Enhancement Shaman, not your typical popular specs before the release of the season. Now that we find ourselves 2 months in, how many things have changed? So this one is the current situation when it comes to the Mythic Plus season, when it comes to melee DPS. So we have a much more thought after top of the melee DPS. Let's just say that Enhancement Shaman is the one that joins the top, and Subtlety is the one that starts splitting some of the time of the rogue players with Outlaw. It's no longer just Outlaw being at the top, but it's Subtlety as well. A few other specs have continued to be quite disappointing, like we thought of from the pre-season and the beta. Arms Warrior, Survival Hunter, Frost, Death Knight, Ret, Paladin were not and currently are not doing too well in Mythic Plus, and a few specs have been juggling one tier or so, but not really that much of a difference compared to what was expected of them, like Feral Druid, Fury Warrior, and Unholy Death Knight. So it does remain quite faithful to what we expected of them before the launch of the season. What about, though, the difference from how things have been going in the raid so far? Because in the raid, we do have some continuation of what we have seen from Mythic Plus, because Havoc is still at the top, Windwalker is still at the top, you still have Enhancement at the top as well. And Fury Warrior continues to perform very well. While in Mythic Plus it didn't do as well as was expected of them, in the raid it has continued to do so. This leaves us with pretty much 3 specs that have maintained their predictions from before the expansion even launched. Havoc, Windwalker and Enhancement, doing very well in both Raid and Mythic Plus, also expected to do well before the start of the expansion. A few more changes in here. Unholy is supposedly doing much worse than expected. You do have the jump upstairs of Red Paladin. We covered our raid update a few days ago, and we saw also Retribution Paladin doing much better than expected as well, and a few other specs continuing to expectedly do not too well, like Survival Hunter or Frost Death Knight. There is the rise as well of Arms Warrior, another one of the buffed specs from 10.0.5, so we will see eventually in a couple of weeks how much more this spec can do with the buffs it has been given. And lastly, also expected Outlaw, not doing as well in the raid like they were doing in Mythic Plus. So this has been the situation so far, the changes so far of the melee DPS from the beta and the first couple of weeks of the preseason into 2 months of the expansion. Our last look of the roles goes to the ranged DPS. So they are the ones that change the most, also because they are the ones that have been buffed or nerfed the most. So this was the preseason, this was the popularity in the preseason, where we saw Devastation Evoker, the new spec, being one of the more popular and one of the more played, as well as seeing Beast Mastery Hunter being one of the more played, and also, interestingly, very little hope was given to the 2 previously and generally speaking more popular mage specs, Frost and Fire, in favor of Arcane. Not much hope, similarly to the end of Shadowlands, to Destro and Affliction in favor of Demonology as well. So after a couple of months of Mythic Plus, this has been the evolution of the ranged DPS. We have gotten a massive rise of Balanced Druid, as we have covered already. The buffs and the changes they received, as well as the major damage increase they gain from their tier set bonus, has made them very, very good, especially in AoE scenarios, in consistent AoE scenarios, which are very, very good and very frequent in Mythic Plus. There is then a whole orgy in the A tier, as we have covered multiple times already. Many of the ranged DPS are trying to fight to reach the S tier, but they haven't quite managed to yet. Balanced Druid has been the first one, and it took them 7 weeks to get there. No other ranged DPS managed to get there before. A few of the specs expected to do well are still there, like Demonology, like Arcane, like Marksmanship. You have a few changes. You have the changes of Devastation Evoker not doing nearly as well as expected from the preseason, although most of that goes down to just being popular because it was the new spec and less about expecting them to be very strong. And then also the fact that Destruction Warlock is now played much more than expected from the preseason, but that has to do not with being wrong, not with not realizing Destro was very powerful, it simply has to do with Destruction being buffed multiple times. So that obviously is the reason why they are now climbing and being way more popular in Mythic Plus. Meanwhile, other specs, despite the buffs, like Frost Mage, like Fire Mage, and like Affliction Warlock, are still quite the underplayed and quite the disappointing specs. We can then compare this to the changes happening in the raid after 2 months. So the main changes, at the very least overall for now, is that Demonology has done a full 360. They went on the opposite side of the ranking and found themselves at the bottom. I believe players have started to realize that the only reason they thought Demo was doing super well is because they were being given about 17 power infusions every single fight, and if you take power infusion away from them, they are actually quite mediocre, especially when it comes to single target, which is the primary damage profile you will find in a raid. So massive loss of Demonology. At the moment, for some reason, we have Affliction performing much better in the raid. We also have a few changes compared to the predictions. Once again, Beast Mastery Hunter was being very popular before the start of the season, but definitely has not shown it in its performance so far in the raid or in Mythic Plus either. It's just being quite poor overall. One spec that improved even more compared to what was expected of them was Arcane. Arcane has been doing quite well, and not many people were putting too much faith in Arcane because they were like, nobody plays Arcane, everyone plays Fire or Frost, plus Arcane is quite clunky, is quite, difficult to play, is quite also unforgiving if you mess up one of its cogs in their rotation for their burst damage. So perhaps many of them were thinking or even hoping that Fire or Frost would be buffed enough to make them viable. So far, this hasn't happened. They have received yet another round of buffs in 10.0.5, so maybe that will put them over the edge, but not for the moment, not for this snapshot of ratings, of rankings at the start of the patch. Shadow Priest has been altogether mediocre, expected to be in the middle and continued to be in the middle all throughout the expansion. To be fair, this is another one of the specs buffed significantly. They were buffed in the hotfix of January and also further buffed in the patch 10.0.5. So there are currently quite a few stocks put into Shadow Priest to do much better, to do quite well in this patch. I would say well in the raid and very well in Mythic Plus in terms of damage profile. They are currently a bit stronger in AoE than they are in single target. And then lastly you have Devastation Evoker, which yes is not doing as good as was thought of them, or at the very least as what the popularity of the spec was hoping for, but it's doing better than Mythic Plus. Now, after the severe round of buffs they received in the hotfix of January 9th, they are also now doing much better in single target as well, which has propelled them to be, I believe, since our last update to our raid review, the strongest spec, at the very least, at the moment in the raid when it comes to ranged DPS. So I think that overall, compared to what we saw before the season launched or before the expansion launched, we have seen some changes in pretty much all of the roles, we can say, for the exception of the healers. We had a single change for the tanks, which was Vengeance Demon Hunter, primarily being the primary change of doing not nearly as good as expected. The melee DPS, it was about perhaps not giving enough trust in enhancement to continue to do well, which they have been doing, as well as other rogue specs doing well other than Outlaw. At the moment, Subtlety is doing quite well, both in Mythic Plus but also in the raid. And when it comes to the range DPS, perhaps the most striking one of the changes is that the two most popular specs before the launch of the season, Beast Mastery and Demo, are one of the worst or one of the, more disappointing specs right now. In the Mythic Plus landscape as well as the raid situation, they have not kept up with what the popularity of the specs was suggesting, at the very least, before the launch of this season. So with this out of the way, we are done with checking with our time capsule of 2 months ago of how the community, the player base was thinking, was predicting about the situation when it comes to the meta, when it comes to the popularity of the specs and what was going to be powerful or popular or flavor of the month at the start of this season. And we have compared how actually things are right now in the season when it comes to both Mythic Plus and the raid. Now, with this comparison done, I'm going to leave you to the rest of your Friday. As I leave, I'm going to, as usual, start my goodbyes with my Patreon supporters as a thanks to the contribution and the support to the growth of this channel. You can still support in completely free ways, like liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to this channel. You can also support by following me on Twitter, which is a good way to check out any news I might give out to my viewers or whenever I go live on stream, etc, etc. That is also the easiest and fastest way to be up to date. And lastly, of course, talking about the stream, historians once said this guy used to go live on stream around 10 PM Central European Time, 1 PM Pacific and 4 PM Eastern US time zones. With this out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, yet another day this week where I wake up before noon. This is starting to get quite worrying.